you. Hello and welcome to our talk on the shifting experiences of the art of teaching when returning to the classroom. Can I have a slide, please? So my name's Faye Short, and I'm delivering this talk with my two colleagues, Nia Young and Laura Ashcroft. And this presentation was really inspired by experiences that the three of us have been through over the last couple of years. I'm the course director for a master's in counselling, and Nia and Laura have just recently graduated from that course. Nia was a lecturer in my department before she started on the course, and she continued as both my student and my academic colleague throughout the course. Laura was a student on the course, but then she became my colleague immediately after graduating when she gained a lectureship teaching on the same programme. So this talk is about our shifting identities as students and teachers throughout this experience, and how that influenced our authenticity and our artistry as educators. Slide, please. As we share our experiences today, I want you to think about how your identity changes in the role of the learner or of the teacher. We've used the analogy of the soldier and the spy in this presentation title, and that's because it can sometimes feel like we're sitting on opposing sides of a battlefield. I know we all want to develop an equal collaboration with our students, but this can be quite challenging when one side has the power to give grades. You know exactly what I mean by that us and them feeling if you've ever been running a classroom exercise, a classroom activity, and they're all at their tables and you walk around and every time you go to a table, all the students just stop talking, or they all suddenly get very interested in the task because you've just arrived. So as we move between the student camp and the teacher camp, how do we adapt to this shift in our power dynamic? And what challenges do we face when we cross the front line to interact as a peer with those who were previously opposite us? How does imposter syndrome creep up to make us question the authenticity of our identity as a teacher or a student? And perhaps most importantly, how do we establish a genuine lecturer-student collaboration in the classroom when sometimes we might feel like we're a soldier for the opposition or a spy in the ranks? Slide, please. So I'd now like to introduce Nia, the student who knew too much.
Hi, thanks, Faye. I'm Nia. So at the point that I started studying with Faye, I had been a lecturer for 8 years in childhood and youth studies. And one of the first things that became apparent to me as I started my studies was that I'm not the student I think I am. So all of the advice that I gave to my students about how to be a good student, I found was not advice I was following. And what that did was really make me question how I was expecting things of students, whether what I expected was realistic or fair, and whether I needed to reflect more on how they were engaging with their studies. And that in itself was one challenge to my sense of identity. But I also took on a role during that time that made Faye my boss in a more direct sense. She's smiling, I can see, but it did make her my boss in a more direct sense. And so stepping into the role of student in that space really triggered an awful lot of imposter syndrome questions for me, because immediately I'm thinking I'm about to generate academic work for somebody who may well be about to find out that I'm not actually the academic I think I am, and that maybe I've snuck in under the radar somewhere. And it was quite stressful to produce that first piece of work and to hand it to a colleague, to my boss, to be assessed. But being on a master's course was quite helpful for that, because there was a lot of talk around setting boundaries, confidentiality, and authenticity in those experiences, and encouragement to talk. On the other hand, I was in a student environment as somebody who knew a lot about the lecturing world and that sort of the way the university worked. And so trying to navigate a sort of identity as a student, using the bits of information that were useful, but not going too far and not carrying anything from that student experience into my professional life, became quite a challenge in itself. So I suppose in the end, I felt that whether I was a student or a colleague, I was always also a soldier and a spy in both contexts. So I'll hand over to Laura, if we can have the next slide, please.
Thank you. So I am Laura and I'm the teacher who only just knows enough. So I originally graduated from Bangor with a bachelor's in music, and then I went on to teach for 10 years. So I taught piano and music theory for 10 years. So when I decided to pursue a career in counselling, it of course meant returning to the classroom and becoming a student once again. So I just seemed to swing like a pendulum backwards and forwards between being the student and the teacher, and then back to student and back to teacher. But stepping back into that role of student, dissimilar to Nia, I found instinctively that I was the student that I always thought I'd been. I am that student that works really hard. I want to do really well. I have really high expectations of myself, and I am a bit of a perfectionist. But it felt good to challenge myself and to pull myself back out of that weird trench that is that kind of baby brain mush that all parents seem to go through, and to really feel like I was using my brain again. So I coped mainly by just being very organised. That's how I got through postgrad study and working at that level. But it was interesting to see how my comrades, my fellow students, were coping in very different ways. So some needed the anxiety of a looming deadline to even kind of get any ounce of motivation and just get themselves going. Others had taken on a huge amount, like Nia, who was still a full-time lecturer as well as doing a full-time master's course. And I don't know how she did it, but she did. And others were quite content to just get through, to just survive, to make it to the end. That was enough for them. But however we managed, we were in it together and we weren't going to leave any man behind. Okay, so now I find that I'm back on the side of teacher. That pendulum has swung once more. And now I am completely in awe of those around me, such as Faye and Nia, and just the vast quantity and diversity of their experience and their expertise. And this is when the imposter syndrome really starts to creep in, and it's still there. And I question myself and I wonder if I really know enough to take on this new identity. But I think it's so easy to quickly forget what it's like to be on that side of the student, to be that officer cadet in the thick of it all down on the ground. And we become quite accustomed to the luxuries and the authority that's offered by being on the teaching side in that commanding post. But I think over time as well, we can get quite weighed down by the responsibility of being on that side. But I think because the transition has been so immediate for me, I've graduated and gone straight back as a lecturer, I'm hoping that it'll be more easy to remember, not just my own experiences, but those of my fellow comrades. And I can use that to kind of help guide the next generation of cadets through that same mission that we've just accomplished together under the guidance of Faye. So while I'm trying to kind of fulfill my new duties and live up to my new role, my new identity, I think I can still completely empathise with our new recruits. And I feel that I very much have a foot in both camps. I can see it from both sides. So I'll pass on to Faye. Thank you.
So as I began teaching Nia, my overwhelming experience was that imposter syndrome. She is a lecturer from the School of Education, for goodness sakes. This was so much worse than one of those single peer observations. She was now going to see every lecture, every activity, every assessment, every piece of feedback. I've been teaching for 20 years, and at that time I was the director of teaching for our whole college. So the expectations felt so high. I began asking myself whether this is where I get found out to be the fraud. And it only got worse when Laura joined our teaching team after graduating. I'd fooled her as a student, but now she's going to see behind the scenes, and she's I'm just bluffing my way through it as an educational imposter. I actually worked through those feelings by sharing them with Nia and Laura, and that highlighted for me the importance of us talking. We laughed about talking with the enemy and joked about that student lecturer divide, and this has really shrunk the distance between those two roles. This experience stirred up so many emotions and doubts for me, but it hasn't shaken my belief that good education happens when there is a really genuine connection between students and teachers. Unlike that most famous of spies, I am stirred but not shaken. In the end, this experience taught me that I never really stopped being a student. As a lecturer, I might not be graded by my students in quite the same way, but I am still learning every day, and my work is still being judged in terms of how they learn. Recognizing that I'm still a student as a teacher helps me to forge those closer connections and break down that no man's land between the identity of a teacher and the identity of a student. Slide for our conclusion. Back to Nia, thanks.
In conclusion,
Can you slide one more time, please?
Yeah. One of the things we've all reflected on is what we can learn from those experiences. And a key theme, I think you've noticed, is that imposter syndrome and that sense of identity, who we are in terms of how well we do something, whether we are the right person for a role. And I think it's not a question of whether any of us as individuals we are, but it's about that belief and feeling it and owning that perspective and that identity. It is a learning process and it's been a really valuable one. So what I think we'd like to invite you to do is reflect on your own opportunities to step back into those different roles and use that learning in your own teaching and to develop your own sense of yourself and an authentic view of yourself within those roles too, so that you can be yourself and believe that you're the best for that role. Thank you very much.
Thank you, and right on time. Well done. Perfect timing. So something that came up in the chat while you were talking is very much related to the different identities of the student. And I wonder whether, again, you could expand a little bit more on that shifting identity when you are a student. So when you sort of start as a student, you're very young, but then you kind of go back to being a student, how that identity shifts and yeah, sort of how that impacts perhaps on your expertise as well.
So sorry, I'm jumping in,
go
but for me, going back into that environment, I remember how I was as an undergraduate, and I was a lot younger when I was doing that. And I'll admit I wasn't always the perfect student back then. I'm going to put it that way. But I did well in my studies, and obviously I enjoyed it because I'm still here doing this now. I think what came for me, stepping back into that world, was knowing that I was going to be submitting for that work to people I was going to have to continue to work with, came with a weight, but also the weight of my own expectation and the things that I suppose, demand of my own students, or the expectations I held, you know, the advice about don't leave things too late, make sure you've done all the reading, make sure you've done all the activities, do all of these things. I found I was balancing a lot of activities, continuing to work and to do the studies. And I found ways to manage, and I did well with them, but they weren't easy. And it gave me that newfound appreciation for what it is I'm asking of my students, really. And when they come and tell me how difficult it is, it actually is. And I've really empathized a lot more with them since that. So it's been valuable for me in that. I don't know about for you, Laura.
I think for me, I did notice a difference between myself as a student doing undergrad as opposed to 10 years later at postgrad. And I don't know if it was the time difference and just kind of age and maturity, or if it was the subject. So I found that I was much more willing to show my weaknesses. At undergrad, that was terrifying. That was embarrassing. I didn't want anybody to feel that I didn't quite know what I was supposed to be doing. At this level, I think I knew that I would just have to. It would be unsafe to go out and work with clients and just try and wing it. It would be completely unethical. So anything that I felt I needed to improve or check, I'd felt confident enough to just go and ask, just speak to Faye or engage with the other tutors. And I felt much more confident to do that. I don't know if that is an age thing or a subject thing, but I can sort of see. And, you know, now we have some very young students come in this year on the cohort that have just come straight from undergrad. And I think it'll be interesting to observe whether they do come to us or whether they kind of hang back. And yeah, look at it from that way.
Yeah, and I suppose again I see that again there are a lot of international sort of staff and people in the chat and in this call, and again I can totally relate to that, because for me my identity as a student kind of changed across countries. So when I moved from one country to the other, and I was a completely different person, or I was allowed to be that completely different person. So again, it's very interesting all that you said about sort of shifting student identities. So something that I wanted to ask you about, you mentioned obviously in your title, shifting identities, again, going to being a teacher, coming back to being a student, and going back again to being a teacher and feeling a little bit you're like an imposter syndrome. I wonder again if you could think about how that shifting sort of can impact positively or possibly also negatively, I don't know, on the developing of the expertise, of the teaching expertise.
I'm happy to come in if you guys are. So I think a couple of years ago I went back and did a master's in law, so I had that experience as well, and so I was really aware of what Nia was going through. And I think for me that shift impacts on our expertise because it helps us to question where we're not experts, where actually our students are experts on themselves, on what works best for them, on their learning patterns, on how they need to approach certain tasks. So it allows me to have that absence of expertise and be okay with that, because I recognized that when I was a student, I needed to balance some things. I needed to take some responsibility for myself in that situation, and we need to let our students do that. And we don't know everything, and we aren't going to be perfect. And as has mentioned several times today, we need to show that to our students, because there is sometimes a real pressure, and I felt it when I've been a student, to be perfect, to prove to my teacher that I am perfect. And sometimes as a teacher, we have that pressure. I need to prove that I'm a perfect teacher, otherwise my students won't trust me. Actually, if as an educator, as the person leading, I can show that I'm not perfect, I don't know some things, and that's okay, then our students start to learn that too. So I think for me, that shift between those two roles has really highlighted that, and that's impacted on my understanding of expertise.
Yeah, thank you for that comment. And again, I love the way you kind of frame the speaking with the enemy connection. And I do. So I was I was a little bit doubtful at the beginning, but I think I see where you're coming from. And again, I wonder if you wanted to say a few more words about that sort of, connection that you have sometimes with the enemy, and why sort of enemy and not friend.
I debated that a lot when I was thinking about that title, because I didn't want to give the impression that we see it as a battle or a war. But the reality is sometimes students do feel quite scared. And, I remember when I started teaching being baffled that students would be nervous coming to speak to me, because it's just me. Why would anybody be scared to talk to me? But I think they do see you as the opposition, the lecturer, the professor. And that can be quite intimidating. And sometimes they see you as the enemy. They have to hide their imperfections. So I think for me, it's about recognizing that and understanding that that might be their perspective in order to be able to try to change that perspective. I'll pass over to Nia to see if she has anything to add.
I think actually I felt more like a double agent quite often, and I found that I probably referenced the fact that I was a lecturer with the student group more than they ever thought about it. And quite a lot of the feedback I got when I was like, oh, if you're uncomfortable because I am, then that's absolutely fine. And the feedback I got was, no, we don't mind. But you're just one of us. Like that's fine. Yeah. And so it was a really lovely environment to be in. But I carried that knowledge that I was sort of a spy as well. And then vice versa. So there were not tensions per se, but just moments where I became very aware that I held knowledge from one side or the other that I wasn't privileged to share in the other space. So that could be useful. I had knowledge that was useful sometimes to my fellow students. I could direct them to the right university services. I could explain processes without it. I could be of use there. But there were also times where, I'd see something come up or somebody'd make a comment about something to do with the university, and I'd be immediately defensive because that's me. That I'm part of that. And so trying to sort of step away from that was tricky. And I suppose in my professional life as well, then not bringing a kind of, yes, but when I'm a student, I don't like, or I don't do this, or, make the university work for me as a student, and recognizing that I'm not the only student that exists. So it was another challenge just to get those balances right. But so part, I suppose, of my expertise development was that learning that, well, there are so very many different ways of doing this. My way is okay. My way works for some people, but it's not going to work for everybody, and that's okay too. That was a really big part of that development.
Yeah, and